everybody. I'm really excited. Today we have Dr. Anthony. Hi, Dr. Anthony.
Hi.
Please tell the
Greg, how are
viewers.
you?
Oh, yeah. Hi. Please tell the viewers who you are. Let them know about your training. Like, tell us the scoop. Like, who?
All right. Well, first off, thanks for having me.
My
It's always
pleasure.
nice to be on a Zoom.
Yes.
um, my name is Anthony Koutsoftas. I'm a speech language pathologist based in New York City, and I've been an SLP for almost 20 years, I think. I did my undergraduate in speech therapy at NYU. I did my
Mhm.
master's at Teachers College, Columbia University. I worked for about 5 years in the New York City Department of Ed in a public school as a speech therapist. And then I took off out west to Arizona State University where I did my PhD. And now I have two hats I wear as a speech therapist. One, I'm a professor of speech therapy at Seton Hall University in New Jersey. And two, I have a private practice here in the city where I provide speech and language therapy and language and literacy services to children, adults, anybody who wants to kick it up a notch in reading and writing I work with. And so that's me.
Yeah, so I have a lot of questions. So, to people that don't know who you are, right? You hear speech language therapist, but what's the connection to literacy? And then I'm definitely going to talk about some of your experiences in the Board of Education and research and all that. But let's just start with that because obviously, like a lot of people don't see that connection.
That's a great question. So most people, when they hear speech therapist, they think speech, spoken language, stuttering, articulation, fixing R's and L's and lisps, which are all things that speech and language therapists do. But our full title is speech and language. So the way I like to explain it is speech and language. And I'm not talking about my hairline. I'm talking about the left side of the brain, which is the majority of where language is understood and expressed. And so if someone has a speaking problem, it could be the speech issues or it could be language issues. Taking that a little bit further, when we talk about language, which is really my business, of everything I do, language is about being able to communicate expressively, to be able to hear language. And then the other way we express and understand language is reading, where we read through our eyes or our fingers if you're blind and you read Braille, or writing, when we write a note or type on the keyboard. And that's another way of expressive language. So speech language therapists work with kids. A lot of us work in school systems, and we found over time that children who struggle with this language stuff, we'll call it, also have difficulties with that reading and writing aspect. And for some reason, I got really interested in that early on. And it became a big part of what I was doing when I worked in the schools, and then why I went and got my PhD, and now the work I'm doing as a professor. And
So, so
yeah.
I'm going to get a little bit off track just for a second. So, in terms of an evolution perspective, because a lot of times people, we take these things for granted, the speaking, listening, reading, writing. Now,
Mhm.
if you go back in time, literacy is pretty new, right? From an evolutionary perspective, we were speaking and listening way before we learned how to read and write,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
No pun
evolution.
intended with the right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
evolutionary wise, of course, but it wasn't that much longer.
sorry. Okay.
So, and even now in modern society, we do, well, it actually, evolution moves quickly. 20 years ago, we would say we spend most of our day listening. But
Mm-hmm.
now, with the dawn of technology, we're actually spending way more time reading and writing
Interesting.
on the
Okay.
phone. And nobody thinks of it that way, but you're not talking, you're using your fingers and eyes. So it's a different kind of writing. It's not you wouldn't write a text message the way you would write a letter or a paper, but it's still reading and writing. So yeah, I guess that is evolution.
Right. And then the thing is with
Yeah.
evolution, in the environment also kind of changes or shapes how our brain also evolves over time too, right?
Mhm.
And sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, go on. I was
Yeah,
listening.
yeah. So what I'm trying to say is to the audience out there is that in order to really understand literacy, you kind of first have to have an understanding of what speech and language, what those
Hmm.
terms mean, right? Because if you kind of skip understanding, I know this gets really complicated, but if you just kind of, I don't care about speech, I don't care about the language part, I just really care about literacy, how my child learns literacy, it's, to get a little pedantic, it is a little myopic, right? You really, to really understand and appreciate how children learn literacy, you really have to understand how, all these different areas of the brain interact, right? From the speech, language to print, right?
Absolutely. It's a reciprocal relationship. So when kids are having problems, let's say you meet somebody, a family, and their child's struggling with reading or writing, you might want to look at them reading a book and watch them write and read their writing. But the thing that we must always remember is you have to look at the oral language part, their ability to listen and comprehend language and how they're speaking. And when someone like me or you works with a family and evaluates a child, we're able to point out, you know what I noticed, your son's favorite word is thing. And that's
Hmm.
kind of an example of word finding difficulties, and that those would translate. So most of the time when I'm working with kids on reading or writing, or adults for that matter, we put the paper and pens away and we just kind of talk out the ideas. It's the foundation. You asked that question earlier about evolution. If you think of like just the evolution or development of
Hmm.
a human being, they come into this world. The first of those four modalities is they're able to listen, and then they start speaking at young ages, and they learn language in the first 3 years of life, which is also the most learning the human brain does. And so that foundation, that strong foundation of oral language that's heard and spoken, becomes the platform that reading and writing leaps from. So they are very much connected.
So let's rewind a little bit. So you graduate with your master's in speech language pathology, speech language
Hmm.
therapy, and now you work for the New York City Department of Education for 5 years.
Hmm.
Can you tell us what type of work you did from a literacy perspective?
Well, so I worked as the school speech pathologist for two elementary schools that shared one building. And so I would work with kids that were mandated for speech therapy. Sometimes it was just articulation. I
Okay.
had one fluency case, but more times than not, it was kids that were struggling with oral language. And when you have that oral language part and you're a part of a school community, and you start talking to teachers and parents, you start noticing that these kids are also struggling with reading and writing. And so it makes for, just like it's reciprocal foundation where you need to have good speaking and communication to read and write. If you want to help kids be better speakers and listeners, you might use a visual component of writing words or reading words. So it was very, very much connected there. Even still to this day, there's still like some speech therapists that don't see their role in literacy. But I always say, well, are you working on language? And they say, yeah. So I say, ha ha, you're helping with their literacy then.
uh,
Sometimes, as long as you have a good language coach, adding
mhm.
that written component's only going to boost outcomes, not defray from them or take away from them.
So let's fast forward. So you go to Arizona, which is one of the top programs for speech language pathology.
Hmm.
And so was your main focus literacy when you got your doctorate?
Yeah, yes, I knew, well, it's actually funny that you asked that. I haven't thought about this in a while. When I started my PhD, my advisor and I would meet weekly, and she's like, "So what are you interested in studying?" And I was actually at that point really interested in narrative language. And so just how kids reiterate stories and retell events of their lives, and why some kids are unclear in that, and how some kids are good at that. And that was also a hot topic at that time. And
Hmm.
so my advisor suggested to me, well, if you want to extend that, why don't we look at that in the written modality? And I was even like, I'm not a teacher, I'm a speech therapist.
Right.
But
Yep.
I
Yep.
started doing some reading. And, the nice thing about the PhD is it's not discipline specific. I learned something about reading and writing, and it can apply not just to speech therapists, but educators, parents, medical professionals, psychologists. So just like the work in those professions influences the work in my own. So that's how I started that journey. I just started reading, and there was like this much on spoken narrative, and there was this much on
Interesting.
written narrative. So I was able to, one of the first studies I did really still gets cited a lot because it was like right there at that tipping point.
Yeah, and you bring there's a few interesting things you mentioned. One is that a lot of times when people hear speech language pathology, they think it's a very narrow, specialized field. But when you're talking about language development, and literacy, this is stuff that, as you said, anybody can access and anyone can use, whether you have a child that has some what's called language-based learning issues, which we'll talk about, or even if your child's advanced,
Hmm.
there's higher levels of language in terms of even adults as writers. Like, we're always honing our
Hmm.
craft, right? We're always learning
Yeah.
vocabulary. It's not a process that just stops. As long as you're involved in literacy, you're always improving these skills.
Hmm.
Now, so one.
And
Yes.
writing is a challenge for everybody.
Yes.
Even the most skilled writers will tell you it's a challenge, and it's interesting to talk to people who do read and write a lot for a living and learn different strategies, but it's not intuitive, or it's not naturally acquired as speaking is.
So yeah, so the next two questions I have, which are tied to that topic, one is in terms of students that are learning how to write. Let's say, starting kindergarten, first grade, second grade. Why is writing one of the most difficult aspects of learning to acquire? And then two, which is kind of connected to that, kids with what are called language-based learning difficulties. If you can let the viewers know what, in general, what that term means, and why,
Hmm.
particularly for kids that have these language-based learning issues, why
Hmm.
writing or reading. I mean, today's topic is more on writing, but in general, why even for that population, why it's more excruciating for them to learn than typical kids.
All right. Well, those are like loaded
Yeah,
questions. So
sorry to throw the
let me
vomit
just
all
put
that
this
on
on.
you. Here you go.
So writing is a challenge to learn because writing involves multiple aspects of the brain. So we started our conversation talking about the language part, where that's just in your head, where you have ideas and you're able to think of a sentence. That's just the first part of writing. You have to be able to, it's just only one part of writing. There's no first part. It's one part of writing. You have to be able to get that down to paper. So for the little kid that's learning how to write, learning this fine motor stuff and able to like grasp the pen, this is not how we want to see kids writing. Like this is good. Sometimes you see kids like this. So even all the fine motor that goes into the graphomotor part of it,
Hmm.
that there's a lot of learning there. Then kids have to learn how to formulate letters, spell words, and then they have to take those ideas that they can talk out pretty easy and put down on paper. And you're also thinking of who you're writing for, what you're writing about. And while you're writing, by the time you get one or two words out, a little kid might have forgotten what the third word is going to be because there's a lot of working memory involved.
You
So
know,
the
it,
answer,
it it
yeah.
almost sounds like if a child's learning how to ride a bicycle, where they have to kind of just motorically try to get in some sort of flow. Now they're trying to juggle and maybe ride like a unicycle or something.
Mhm.
So it seems like for some students they can get overloaded with all of these tasks that are being thrown at them at once.
Absolutely. And if kids have never even, if kids have never even been exposed to some sort of writing implements, that's important. So like kids that are drawing and coloring, they're already on their way to getting some of this fine motor that they need. But they also need to be explicitly taught how to write. We
Hmm.
can't take for granted the importance of teaching kids this is how you make an A, and with good instruction and evidence-based instruction. And sometimes that's something that kindergarten still isn't compulsory in New York State, for example. So if you missed
I know.
kindergarten, you might have
Yeah.
missed instruction for letters. Or
Hmm.
if you're in first grade with the teacher that's really good with teaching letter writing, and then second grade you're with the teacher, but another kid is in the first grade in the classroom where writing isn't taught, Then you get to second grade, and now that teacher expects you know how to write. So there's a lot of things that go into it.
And I have to say also, like my son is in first grade. He happens to be, I mean, fortunately he has very good language skills and academically he's doing well, but just he's at a public school. And I gotta say that the curriculum is grueling. And I'm surprised, I mean, for even a bright kid like him, you know, it's gotta be scary if your child starts to fall behind.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just unbelievable to watch the pace of what they're doing at, you know, today's, like, you know, when
Mm-hmm.
we were younger, we were in terms of what was expected in first grade, was the norms were different, but
Mm-hmm.
just the amount of in terms of writing that they have to do at this point,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I mean, they don't care necessarily about the spelling per se, but the output. There's an expectation that you need a lot of output. You have to write a lot. You're going to have enough motoric control where it's
Mm-hmm.
legible and it's decent, and even in terms of some of the punctuation,
Mm-hmm.
it's not like mandatory, but there, you know, all these things that they're going on at once. And it's one of those things, like once a child starts to fall behind, maybe they just fall behind with the handwriting, or maybe they're having trouble getting the output, the written output. And that's,
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of segueing to one example could be students with language-based learning disabilities. And can you talk more about that?
Absolutely. So children with language-based learning disabilities are children who struggle with language. Again, this part of the brain, they have normal cognition. They're sometimes even gifted. They have strengths in many other areas, but when it comes to language, they're not good. They're not strong with expressing themselves orally, comprehending language. And so that big piece of the writing process is weaker for those kids. And then you pair that with the motor and having to write to a prompt and having to write a creative prompt and a lengthy prompt. It makes it even that much more challenging.
Got it. So now let's say you're a parent and you have a child, maybe, you know, first, second grade. Um, and so what, or, you know, let's say just elementary school, like what are some red flags? Like if you're a parent that they may suspect that maybe your child might have a language-based learning issue, like when you know, sometimes obviously teachers will flag, like, you know, you know, something's up with your
Hmm.
child, or sometimes teachers don't, the parents may think something's going on.
Hmm.
What could you mention, maybe some red flags that,
So the
yeah.
things there's a whole myriad of reasons why that a child could present language difficulties, and sometimes, in the earlier grades, it's usually easier to identify because there might have been a preschool history of speech and language therapy or delayed communication. The challenge is when kids are older, fourth and fifth grade, and they're struggling with academics, reading and writing, and then we investigate and we realize there's language challenges that were there. So some of the things I mentioned earlier, non-specific words. So children that say the thing, the stuff, and really have a hard time. Like if you say to them, not the thing, and they're able to say the phone, I'm not so worried. But if they're using that word a lot, it's challenging. If it's a red flag. If they're unable to follow directions or comprehend, follow conversation, that's sometimes a red flag. And I think when kids are telling a story, and you aren't able to understand it, especially as the parent, sometimes parents know what their kid is talking about, so they fill in all those blanks. But when another adult is like, I wasn't really able to follow that, and it was something that a child should be able to retell, that might also be a red flag.
So what you're also saying, which we've alluded to before, is that your child might be, if your child is, let's say, struggling with literacy, that, you know, sometimes you have to take a step back. Are they struggling sometimes with the auditory information that's coming
Absolutely.
in, some of the, you know, the
Mhm.
expressive language stuff that's coming out? And yeah, so
Yeah. With the
yeah, yeah,
literacy component,
yeah.
so kids that have an aversion to books or aversion to writing, like they just don't want to do it, and that's usually meaning it's usually a red flag that there's something behind that's difficult for them. Kids that like the same stories read over and over, that they end up memorizing it, and so they're unable to like retell it or show good comprehension, and kids that maybe write by copying, which would be really hard to detect, but
Mm-hmm.
they might just be copying words and it doesn't make any sense, or their sentences are very short. Um, I don't think spelling is an indicator of difficulties.
Mm-hmm. So just a disclaimer for people that are watching is, one, if a child is possibly demonstrating some difficulties with literacy, it may not actually be also a language-based learning difficulty. There could be other reasons why the child is struggling. But at the end of the day, if you're a parent and you're concerned, you should definitely try to reach out to a licensed psychologist, like that's trained in detecting learning
Hmm.
difficulties. Speech language pathologists also are licensed therapists that do assessments as well. And then there's you work a lot with occupational therapists. You want to do your OT crowd and do a favor and plug them?
Oh, yes, I do that. So at the university, I've learned a lot. I've been working at my university. We have a project right now going on. It's called Project Right to Learn. Project Right to Learn. And we're working with occupational therapists and speech pathologists. We're training graduate students together to conduct writing assessments. And some of the things we're learning from both professions, of course, occupational therapists are learning a lot about language and spelling and grammar and the language skills needed. But we're also learning a lot about motor skills and body positioning and visual perception and self-regulation. I mean, if you're having a bad day, you don't want to write. And if
Right,
you're a
yeah.
kid having a bad day, it's really hard to communicate that. And your
Hmm.
writing might not be the best that day, or it might not be a good, kids have to be ready and stimulated to learn. So, mhm.
And yeah, and the emotional piece is really
So we're
important,
learning a
right?
lot about
Yeah.
them.
Yeah, and so
Mhm.
this gets multidisciplinary. So writing is not just really for one profession; it's for almost any profession that deals with children. Whether you're a teacher, whether you're some sort of licensed therapist,
Mhm.
um, and
And
then
yeah, there's a lot
yeah.
of implications for writing and psychology as like a reflective practice for
Mm-hmm.
for mindfulness. The other thing I that you mentioned is writing across the curriculum. So by
Mm-hmm.
the time kids are at in sixth, seventh grade, and they have a social studies teacher and a science teacher, those teachers assign written work, and they assume that kids know how to write, which many of them are able to do the writing and they're able to spell words. But something that teachers and subjects have to teach is, how is writing expected in science or social studies? A
Mm-hmm.
lot of kids right now are learning to take their seed ideas and develop them into colorful language with lots of description. And that's all well and good, but that has no place in the sciences. So it's
Mm-hmm.
almost like a different register where you have to write very clear and very frank to make sure a clear message is there. So there's also that component to writing.
Yeah, and that's a whole other, topic where writing is not an all or none skill, right? It's not like you learn how to write, you're done, right? As you know,
Yeah.
the middle school, high school demands are very different. There's different genres of writing where maybe you can be good or excel in one area of writing, and you may kind of and maybe weak in another area. And then, as you know, as an academic too, right? The
Mhm.
style of writing is different. So it's something. The whole writing process is very dynamic.
Absolutely.
Um, and it's really, professionals, what they do is they identify what the demands are, what those writing demands are, and the strengths and weaknesses of that
Mhm.
child and how to help that child. So before we end now, let's say you're a parent, you have a child in elementary school, and they detect some writing difficulties, maybe some language-based learning issues, and they get an evaluation. What are some tips? What are some of your top tips for families for helping struggling writers?
So for struggling writers, the number one thing, when in doubt, assess it out. Like, you want to get an assessment from the school, or
That's
if
a
the
great
if the
T-shirt, by
if
the
the
way.
timing is, yeah, I
Eh,
know. I always coming up with these one-liners.
yes.
Oh, don't forget to let me show you my T-shirt
Yes.
before I
Thank you.
leave, if
Yes.
it's
Thank you. Stay
related.
tuned.
But
Yes.
when in doubt, assess it out. Yeah, and parents know their kids better than anybody else. So if the parents know that they have a feeling that there's something wrong, there
Mm-hmm.
usually is, or there's
Mm-hmm.
something going on, there usually is. So your school is the first line of defense. Sometimes that's a timely process. If you have a little money to invest, you can go to a private practitioner for an evaluation. And then when it comes to working with your kid, just like I would say if a child's struggling with reading, one of the most important things as a parent to do is read with that child. If a
Mm-hmm.
child's struggling with writing, one of the most important things you want to do is write together.
That's
Even if
great.
you're sitting down coloring in a coloring book and the parent starts writing letters that they might color in, or during this time right now, maybe if you're writing a letter or a note to somebody, you say, come on, let's go write a note to grandma. And we sit down, and even if they just watch you, and then as they get comfortable, maybe they'll sign their name, or if they're older and they need to get their words on paper, the most important thing to remember is if you could think about something, you can say it. And if you could
Mm-hmm.
say it, you write it. If your kid's struggling, have them talk, you write it out. And that's a way to get that process started.
No, that's great. You know, it's one of those things where you kind of slip under the rug with a child, because if a child sees a parent doing it, then the expectations kind of are like, well, if my parents are doing it, I can understand if they want me to do it. But the flip side, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm doing it, my parents aren't doing it, you may get more resistance. So that's great. And also just the touch of just, you know, it's so funny, like, you know, everyone these days, it's, you know, texting, emailing, but a good old fashioned, you know, handwritten note
Yeah.
goes a long way.
And absolutely, and parents are writing.
Yeah.
Parents, you're writing all the time anyway.
Yep. That's
So
true.
instead of reading the recipe from your phone, which never works out for anybody, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
take a piece of
Yep.
paper. Let's write out the steps. You want to make the cupcakes, kid? You write out the steps. I'll read them to you. You could turn
Mm-hmm.
these things into a written component. I want to show you. I have a post office on my
Okay.
desk. This is I have an old school address book. It's taken
That's
up
great.
letter writing, and it's
Uh,
notes to people,
that's great.
and so it's been fun. And even with my nieces and nephews, I send them coupons for lollipops, and if they want the coupon, they have to fill it out and mail it back to me. That'll keep them honest and teach them some writing,
That's
so
great.
yeah.
No, and it's also like, you know, it's funny when you say things like that. I remember back in the day, like pen pals.
Hmm.
I don't know now if it's just like email pals or whatever, but there's that social connection, which is really important with.
I heard this in a TED talk once. The
Hmm.
reason why I like cards and in this TED talk, it's like the person that sent that to you touched it.
Yep.
They put
Yep.
thought into it. It
Yep.
was, and now in a time,
Yeah.
I don't want to bring up the social
Yeah.
isolation, but
Yeah.
it's kind of nice when
It
you
is.
get an email, or a lot of people are struggling. I've been sending some notes just to
That's
cheer
great.
some up, and with the kids I work with, to get them to do some writing. So it's a great
Hmm.
opportunity to start doing that. But writing doesn't have to be pen only. You can do this
Yep.
stuff on the
Yep.
keyboard. The kids
Hmm.
that are struggling, this becomes a game. There's too many distractions. We already talked about how complicated it is. Just sitting with a piece of paper and a marker or crayon is just is just as good.
Well, Dr. Anthony, I really appreciate you being here. You know, our YouTube channel is relatively new, and what we might do at some point, once this is posted, at a later point, we might do something live if you're interested, with people that watch this video and want to ask you questions. But we would love to have you back.
Absolutely.
Great, awesome. Well, thanks again.
I would love to be here.
And
Thanks for having me, Craig.
and definitely for people, please click on the subscribe and like us. We'll have links that will highlight some of Dr. Anthony's work, and we hope to see you again sometime soon.